This is also live on YouTube. Good afternoon and welcome to today's edition of Carnegie India's Political Economy Seminar Series. I'm Suyash Rai, I'm the moderator for this discussion. In this seminar, we'll discuss a paper on measuring trade facilitation. This paper was published under our working paper series in May of this year. It makes an important and unique contribution to the literature on performance measurement in governments. It is written by two civil servants on a topic that they're deeply familiar with. Both Ms. Sruti Vijayakumar and Mr. Vijay Singh Chauhan are serving revenue service officers. Ms. Vijayakumar is Deputy Commissioner at Jawaharlal Nehru Customs House, and Mr. Vijay Singh Chauhan is the Customs Authority for Advanced Ruling. As you will see, they have brought forth many useful insights on this topic. But without giving away too much, I'll just say one point that struck me when I was reading this paper. It is that while internationally comparable measures like the ease of doing business and other indices are useful sometimes, no country should rely too much on measures provided by external organizations. Each country, especially a country like India, should build robust measures of its own performance and try to improve it over time. This is especially important for functions which are like trade facilitation, which are complex functions which involve both some degree of regulatory as well as facilitating aspects. So you have multiple objectives being pursued at the same time, and often the external organization that is measuring may miss the kind of balance that the country wants to strike. To discuss this paper, I'm also joined by three experts as discussants. Dr. Abhijit Das is a head and professor at Center for WTO Studies at Indian Institute of Foreign Trade in Delhi. He has previously worked at UNCTAD and in the Trade Policy Division in the Commerce Ministry. Shri Vivek Johri is a member of Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs. He has previously held many key positions, including as Minister Customs at India's permanent mission to WTO and as the Joint Secretary of the Tax Research Unit. Dr. Harsha Vardhan Singh is chairman of Ikthwaj Advisors LLP, which is an advisory firm working on trade policy, industrial policy, and regulatory issues. He's also associated with the Fletcher School at Tufts University and with the South Asia Center at Atlantic Council. Relevant for this discussion is the fact that in 2005 and 2013, he was the Deputy Director General at WTO. We will have the discussion in three parts. First, I will invite the authors to present their paper. After that, I will invite the discussants to offer their remarks for 10-12 minutes each. We will then take comments and questions from the audience, and I may also pose a few questions and make some comments in that time. You can enter your comments or questions on Zoom through the Q&A link that you can see below, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can send your questions there as well through the chat function. Now I would like to invite Mr. Chauhan and Ms. Vijayakumar to present their paper.
Thank you, Suyash. Thank you, Carnegie. Thank you, Abhijit Das and Harsha Vardhan Singh. Mr. Vivek Johri would be joining. I would just like to add where this paper actually comes from. In 2017, I was posted as Commissioner of Customs at JNCH. Thereafter, Mr. Johri joined there as the head of the JNCH, and Shruti had just joined the service at that point of time, and then thereafter she had an occasion to work at JNCH as well. So this paper essentially is a result of our experience of working at JNCH, what we did, what were the challenges that we faced, and how we thought we need to put it all together for us to learn ourselves and for others to understand. It was more an effort on our part to understand the larger canvas of things that we were dealing with, and in some sense, which was the tools which were being used to assess our own performance. So even as we say that this is a paper which is evidence from India, we look at this paper at two levels. One is the macro level, where we look at the indicators for the country as a whole. And when we look at the micro picture, it essentially is about Jawaharlal Nehru Custom House, which I'll continue to refer as JNCH. Now, why JNCH? The first point I said, because we are most familiar with it. But more importantly, JNCH is the largest custom house in the country. It collects about 20% of the duties on imports in the country. JNCH as a custom house caters to Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust, JNPT, which is the largest containerized port in the country, and world over it's ranked 33rd. So it's the largest port. So the role of JNCH in logistics supply chain in the country is very important. And whatever is done by the JNCH custom house has its implication for the custom houses across the country. During the period or even before and after, JNCH in some sense has been the live laboratory for tests or the policy and administrative changes that the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs, that CBIC, actually tries and implement and test. The time release study that we'll talk of subsequently essentially is a kind of a circular mechanism where you measure things, draw conclusions, implement them, and see how it actually works out. So the next concept that's important to understand is trade facilitation, because it's trade facilitation that we are measuring. In some sense, we can say trade facilitation includes, it comprises simplification, modernization, and harmonization of processes relating to export and import. While large part of the paper is relevant to both import and export processes, when we go into the time release study, etc., the focus is essentially on imports. That's partly because that's how the customs organization or customs implications are concerned. It's partly also because in most of the countries, the regulatory mechanism is far more directed towards imports than exports. The power of performance measurement needs no emphasis. We all know how important it is. There is a very popular saying which goes like, what gets measured gets done. We saw that happening in some sense at JNCH. At the point of time, the emphasis on ease of doing business, which is perhaps the most popular indicator to measure performance for ease of doing business, of which trade facilitation, or what is called trading across borders, is one of the 10 components that is measured. And the results thereof were something by which we were being assessed. In addition to that, ever since the beginning of almost 1990s, the World Customs Organization, which is the apex multilateral body for all the customs organizations in the world, has been recommending conduct of time release study. And this time release study was being done at JNCH even before that. But when we were there and the Trade Facilitation Agreement came into force, we tried to actually broad base, diversify, and make it far more comprehensive and accessible to people in trying to understand what exactly was being reflected by the time release study. With the use of time release study, we realized its potential for two basic things. One was to use it for evidence-based policy making. And the second one was, which I think is more important, is that we used it as a tool for outreach to the trade. Because in trade facilitation, the quality of trade facilitation is very important. Trust plays very important role. So if we used data to actually reach out to the trade and convince them of the real genuine benefits of trade facilitation for everyone concerned. Shruti, can you go to the first year? Yeah. So thereafter, it's important to understand what we mean by time release study. Time release study is one of the methods by which we calculate or capture or study the average release time of cargo. What is average release time? The average release time is essentially the time that is taken from the arrival of the cargo at a port to the time that the goods are eventually released to the importer or the trade representative. Time release study is only one of the methods by which average release time can be measured or is reported. And in fact, one of the attempts that we do in the second part of the paper is essentially to capture all the publicly available data available on average release time measure, including the time release study, and make a comparison thereof. one of the reasons why we covered JNCH is also because this has the most comprehensive and continuously running publicly available data on time release study that began almost in 2013. So we have the data available in public domain, and most of the study that we have captured, even though we had access to the data that we had because we were part of the customs officers at JNCH, this study actually covers the data which is publicly available to everyone. The second measure, and which is more popular and most of the people are familiar with, is actually ease of doing business. It captures 10 indicators, of which one of them is trading across borders. In trading across borders, there are two components. It tries to measure both time and cost involved and covers both export and import. In India, it covers two places for import and export. One of them is JNCH, and that is why we have ready available data for comparison between the time release study data and the survey data from the ease of doing business. What was most surprising to us, and that is in some sense the trigger for us to take up the study, was that in 2017, the ease of doing business survey reports indicated that the average release time at JNCH for a particular commodity through a particular country was as high as 280 hours. While all the data that we had, and the data that we had was all sourced from the customs automated center. So these are precise timestamps which are unimpeachable. And when we calculated that, we found that it was 2 times or 2.5 times more than what the data we actually had. So we realized that we were in some sense facing a perception challenge, that the surveys were actually not reflecting the actual performance on the ground. And having realized that, we thought that it would be very useful for us to get into deeper and more robust study to see how exactly the other indicators, if there are any, would actually show our performance. So the first trigger, if I was to say, was our familiarity with the ease of doing business, with the time release study and what all it was capable of. The second one was the difference between the results that were brought out by ease of doing business and the time release study. Now let's move and look at the TFA and what actually it mandated, or what is the trigger that we got from the Trade Facilitation Agreement for our study going forward. Trade Facilitation Agreement is an international agreement under the aegis of the WTO, and it essentially aims to reduce trade costs. It has 24 articles, of which 12 have specific commitments that are expected to lead to reduction in trade costs. All these commitments are basically categorized under 3, A, B, and C. India categorized 72.3% of the commitments under category A and remaining 27.7% in category B. None of the commitments were categorized as category C by India, and as we speak, India has fulfilled its commitment in respect of about 78% of the TFA commitments, and that's in line with the timelines which are prescribed under the WTO agreement. The TFA in specific Article 7.6 actually encourages the countries to measure and publish average release time, and it says including the time release study of the WCO. So that's a mandate which is there that needed to be fulfilled. In order to implement the Trade Facilitation Agreement, India set up a National Committee on Trade Facilitation, which is a civil services dominated body. It is headed by the senior most civil servant, that's the Cabinet Secretary, and it drew up a large list of items, 96 specific measures to promote trade facilitation. It included the category A and category B items of the TFA. And in addition to that, it drew up a whole list of items which were essentially relating to promotion of infrastructure and IT to promote trade facilitation, and they were covered under the rubric of what is called TFA plus. All these commitments were classified under short term, medium term, and long term, and the lead agencies for their implementation was also nominated. One of the things in compliance of Article 7.6 of the Trade Facilitation Agreement was that it also prescribed the target release time for cargo separately for the seaport, airport, land custom stations, etc., and for imports and export. For the purpose of this study, let me just specify that the average release time target under the National Trade Facilitation Action Plan was 48 hours for import sea cargo. So that's 48 hours is the target that is expected to be achieved at JNCH. And as I said, that the ease of doing business report, when it began, was kind of indicating that the average release time was 280 hours. So they were totally mismatched. So we made a whole lot of effort to understand and bring it as close to possible. So that's part of the exercise that we were involved in. So in the NTFAP, the next aspect that we noticed was that because it went beyond just the category A and category B commitments and had drawn up a list of TFA plus items as well, it also referred to certain other studies or performance measures and cited very briefly reference to those indicators, which included ease of doing business of the World Bank and logistics performance index again of the World Bank and trade facilitation index of the OECD, and said that we need to draw conclusions from the trends of these reports as well. Having got all of this together and realizing that the trade facilitation, that performance measurement is of such importance, we thought at the end of it that why should we not just try and put all of it comprehensively together and see what are the insights we can draw from this. So the third is the conclusion that we draw. So we capture 6 composite indicators. When we say composite indicators, these indicators are essentially covering the country as a whole, and those 6 indicators have multiple components. So they are not unidimensional like the average release time, which is captured by the time release study, the study at the JNCH, which measures average release time. We put them in 3 sets of buckets depending on the data source. So the first data source is actually the customs automated system. We live in an environment where 99% and at Nhava Sheva almost 100% of the cargo clearance is through in the electronic environment. So every action has a digital footprint. We use that to calculate the release time. The time release study of Nhava Sheva is an annual document. However, CBIC produces a monthly release time data, which is simplistic and comes with a lag. And the third one, and then thereafter, the next one is basically what is called the LDB. So the unit for measurement for the time release study is a document which is called the bill of entry, whereas some people are interested in calculating time for the container, which is the unit of packaging. LDB actually uses RFID based container movement and tracks the release time. And the third one, as I said, is EODB, which is actually a perception. It asks respondents to say how much time does it take and different components thereof, and adds all of them together and says this is what the release time is. So with this broad context in which we went and conducted this study, I'll request my colleague Shruti to actually share the results and the details of the study that we've done. Shruti.
Shruti, you're on mute. Could you please unmute it?
Thank you, sir. A very good afternoon. As sir had mentioned, the paper covers a comprehensive review of publicly available data relating to trade facilitation, as well as key performance indicators in the ecosystem of cross-border movement of goods. So here in this table, this is a sort of brief on the various indicators that we're talking about. Keeping in view the scope of our paper, we have studied 6 survey-based composite indicators, which is shown here in this table. This table sort of covers the scope as well as the frequency of the various indicators that we discussed in our paper. And along with these 6 composite indicators, we also discuss 3 technology-driven release time data pertaining to Jawaharlal Nehru Custom House. So I will start by discussing a brief on each of these indicators. Suyash, is it okay if I shift to the PowerPoint, because we have linked certain slides, hyperlinked certain slides to the indicators here.
Yes, yes, sure.
Thank you. So here the first indicator we see is the OECD's trade facilitation indicator. Now, though this indicator best represents and most closely approximates the provisions of the trade facilitation agreement, I will discuss this.
Shruti, sorry to interrupt, we can't see the full screen. We are still seeing the first slide only. I think it's the full screen presentation mode is not getting shared. So maybe you can just operate it from here, like this, with the next slide.
Is it visible now? Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it now. Yes.
Okay. So here, these are the 6 composite survey-based indicators that we discussed in our paper. Though the first indicator we discuss about in our paper is OECD's trade facilitation indicator, because that most closely approximates the provisions of the trade facilitation agreement. I will be discussing this indicator once I discuss the other indicators. For reasons I will explain when we discuss the indicator. So the first indicator that we will be looking at is the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. So the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index is the most popular and widely known performance indicators for the reason that there are longer time series data available, and it has a larger geographic coverage. Additionally, it covers both time as well as costs. Now, the EODB, as sir had mentioned, covers 10 doing business topics, such as starting a business, paying taxes, and trading across borders, which we will also discuss in the subsequent slides. Now, if we view this graph over here, we can see that India's performance has been improving from 2014 to 2020. So from 2014 to 2020, there has been some stagnation. The reason for this stagnation we found is because of the relatively better performance of certain other countries. And in this graph, it shows that there is a significant improvement in the release time data starting from the year 2017 onwards for India. The next indicator that I'll be talking about is the World Bank's Logistic Performance Index. The LPI measures both the rank as well as the score for economies in respect of 6 indicators. So this graph, in this graph, it presents the results in respect of the various 6 indicators, which is listed below. So here, it is expected that based on the trade facilitation measures that are currently prevalent, that the expected result would have been that there would have been an improvement in the LPI score. But as we can see here in the graph, from 2014 to 2016, there has been an improvement in respect of all the indicators. However, from 2016 to 2018, there has been a decline in respect of all the indicators. Another noticeable point from this graph is, in respect of all the 6 sub-indicators, we have found a pattern of decline, which we did not find in respect of indicators in case of World Bank's ease of doing business, as well as the OECD's TF5, wherein we found that the trend for sub-indicators were varying. In some cases, there was no uniform trend, as we can see here in the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index. The next indicator is the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index. So some of the pillars of the GCI have been seen to have a strong linkage with trade facilitation, such as infrastructure, trade openness, and import of goods and services, which is covered under the market size. So in the GCI, the economy's performance is rated on a scale from 0 to 100, with 100 being the best. So in the graph, if you notice, for the year from the year 2017 to 2018, there is a big jump in respect of the score. So the reason for this is, after 2017, there was a revision in the methodology. There has been a change in the methodology, which has resulted in a drastic jump from 4.59 to 62.1 for the score. And if you see from the years from 2014 to 2017, there has been a gradual improvement in the score for India. However, on the after the revision of methodology, it is seen that India's rank as well as the score has declined. However, it is also important, it's also noteworthy that though there is a decline of score for India, it still ranked best among all the South Asian nations. The next indicator is the World Bank's World Governance Indicators. In this graph, we present the data from the year 2010 to 2018. So the important aspect that this graph highlights is that the sub-indicators of government effectiveness, which is the dark blue dotted line, and regulatory quality, which is the light blue dotted line, and control of corruption, which is the light blue line, which have a significant correlation with trade facilitation or ease of doing business, have shown a perceptible improvement since 2015. The final composite survey-based indicator that we discuss in our paper is the global survey, is United Nations Global Survey on Trade Facilitation and Paperless Trade Implementation. This indicator captures as well as validates the various trade facilitation initiatives of CBIC. In the graph, we note that initiatives for simplification of customs procedures, improvement in digitization, and reduction in paper-based processing are reflected in the improved scores in respect of cross-border paperless trade, formalities, and transparency. So these are 3 indicators. Here in the graph, it's visible that there is an improvement in India's score. So this is in line with the government initiatives for improving trade facilitation. The final indicator that I'll be discussing is OECD's Trade Facilitation Indicator. So this indicator most closely approximates the provision of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It comprises of 11 sub-indicators, and the scoring is done from 0 to 2, with 2 being the best. If you notice in this graph, there are 2 graphs that we have. The one on the left says revised score, and the one on the right is the pre-revised score. Interestingly, when we started doing our research on this paper, based on the data available at the OECD website for the year 2015, 2017, and 2019, we found that India's performance in respect of all the sub-indicators had declined from the previous years. Subsequently, we noticed a change in the OECD's in the data which was represented in OECD's website. In the sense, there was a change in the scores, as well as the data for 2015 was not available. To understand the reasons for this particular change, we wrote to the OECD team, who responded that the reason behind these modifications is because there is a fine-tuning in their methodology that had happened to include more the indicators in much more detail, as well as to deepen the analysis of the various components of the indicators. And also there was a revision in their scoring pattern. So once the revision of the scoring pattern happened, and when the fine-tuning of the methodology happened, we noticed that India's score had improved. India's score had improved in respect of 8 sub-indicators, remain unchanged for 1, which is improvement in which is involvement of trading community, and declined marginally for 2, which is 1 is advance ruling and the second was appeal procedures.
It's very interesting that the 2 areas where India continues to show a decline between 2017 and 19 is appeals procedure and advance rulings. And it is fortuitous that right now I'm posted as Commissioner of Customs for advance ruling. We hope that in the next round of study, the fact that I'm posted there and we are doing good work gets reflected in our performance.
Yes.
Sruti, continue.
Yeah, so the revision of the scores for India by OECD suggests that the methodology adopted by OECD is still evolving. And we also feel that the revised data is more aligned with the evidences regarding improvement of the trade facilitation measures in India. And another point we noted is that the revised fine-tuned, the data brought out of the revised fine-tuned methodology of OECD in its TFI is also aligned with the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. So based on these broad trends of the above indicators, we note that India's review in respect to the rank and score presents a mixed picture. The country has shown relatively consistent improvement according to some indicators, as in the case of World Bank's Ease of Doing Business. But in the case of certain indicators, the trend has been uneven. And the unevenness becomes more pronounced when you go into the level of sub-indicators. This line diagram summarizes the results of the 6 composite indicators, combining the rank as well as the score, wherein to the right are 4 indicators showing improvement, and to the left are 3 showing the decline. The distance between the indicators here is does not have any quantitative implication. This line diagram is only indicative of India's performance in each of these indicators. Also in this figure, we've included OECD TFI's revised as well as the pre-revised score, just to highlight the substantive shift in reported in India's performance once there was a revision of methodology. So overall, if you see the summary of India's performance in this line diagram, we can see that India's performance is improved in respect of EODB, paperless trade, trade facilitation and governance, whereas it is shown a declining performance in respect of logistics as well as competitiveness. So the second section of our study talks about the second section of our study focuses on measurement of release time data. This section highlights the import release time for the largest containerized port in the country, which is JNPT, as well as Jawaharlal Nehru Customs House. So there are 3 subsections over here. First, we discussed the intertemporal average release time data, which is computed from the customs automation system. The second is the average import release time computed using RFID technology, which is the LDB. And the third, we also discussed two survey-based studies. One is the trading across border sub-indicator of EODB, and second is the total transport and logistics cost of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. So the first is the release time based on timestamps from the customs automation system. In this graph, we capture the data of CBIC's dwell time, which is monthly published in the CBIC website. And we also capture the data in respect of the Jawaharlal Nehru Customs House TRSs for the years from 2017 to 2019, which is the asterisk shown there. And the third is the national TRS data, which is the triangle. Our observations and analysis based on the data that we have here projected in this graph is that we notice a trend of improving monthly release time. That is the first observation. The second is there is a consistent improvement in release time by the annual TRS. So we can see that from 2017 to 2020, the release time has drastically improved. And third, there is a pronounced increase in release time for the period of July 2017 to September 2017, which also approximates the same time in which the goods and services tax was introduced. And the fourth finding is that we've noticed better release times in the months in which TRS was conducted, which could probably be due to the various outreach efforts that happened during the set time. The next, we present the dwell time based on radio frequency identification tracking. So using RFID technology, the logistics data bank captures the dwell time of containers in the ports, in the CFS, as well as the container freight stations, as well as the inland container depot. The LDB presents segregated data for the overall JNPT region, which comprises of the time at the port, the time taken for transfer of the containers from the port to the CFSs, and the overall CFS dwell time. So we added these three times to arrive at these three timestamps to arrive at the overall release time of the cargo from JNCH. This graph summarizes. In this graph, we compare the LDB data along with the average release time data from customs automation system, and we observe that there is a broad consistency in the monthly data of the customs automation system as well as the RFID based tracking system. The third set of data that we discuss about is the survey-based study. The first one being the trading across borders component of the ease of doing business. This trend, the trading across borders trend, reflects a gradual improvement in release time from the years up till 2018, and from 2018 onwards, we see a drastic improvement in the release time, which also coincides with the same periods wherein the TFA efforts gain momentum. So on analysis of the JNCH data based on these three studies, we find that there is a evident improvement in the release time in respect of all the three sets of these studies. That is those based on the customs automation system, that based on RFID technology, as well as the survey-based study indicators. And further, the one-off study of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, also we noticed that there was a average transit time for border clearance of 113.6 hours, which is also found consistent with found in line with the other data sets. So we move on to the findings of the two sets of indicators, the composite survey-based indicators as well as the release time database studies. In respect to the survey-based indicators, we noticed that there is a diversity in the result regarding India's performance, in the sense that these indicators have not necessarily been moving in agreement with each other, and also some trends are clearly counterintuitive, like in the case of OECD's trade facilitation indicator, wherein we found a deterioration of India's score in respect of all the sub-indicators of the trade facilitation indicator. We also find that the survey-based indicators, there is some amount of subjectivity, and it's based on a great extent, it's based on the individual assessment and the perception of the respondent. Finally, we also note that there are challenges regarding the data and methodology in survey-based indicators, which is evident from the fine-tuning of methodology undertaken by the OECD, and also the recent decision of the World Bank to conduct a systematic and assess a systematic review of the data of the last 5 years of the doing business reports. And also another finding that this paper establishes that is that in respect of all three release time measures on technology-based timestamps, which is the CBIC dwell time study, the time release study, the LDB dwell time reports, we notice that there is a similar trend. In that sense, it is generally recognized that the release time analysis for import and export cargo is by far the most meaningful metric that encapsulates the performance of border management agencies and processes. So this is a brief of the findings of our report. I request Chauhan sir to take over for the conclusions of our paper.
Thank you, Shruti.
Thank you.
Yes, so most of the conclusions in that sense are fairly obvious. When we looked at the composite indicators, we found dissonance at the macro level. And we, in fact, in our paper have also taken some of the sub-indicators which we thought should be more aligned in terms of the trend, but we found that even there, it wasn't so. When we looked at the release time data, and we realized, and we know that technology-driven data is available. So when we use an indicator which is more specific and try and capture the release by that, it shows more what should I say, trends which are clearer, and therefore what we realize is that we eventually conclude on the basis of the data that when we measure the release time, which is the ultimate outcome, it shows more consistent results than the enablers of trade facilitation, which are more difficult to measure. So they're more subjective, and particularly when you go and do a survey, then the results are more subjective. So if I was to conclude, we don't say it in our paper in so many words, time release is a very, very robust method of judging the performance, and it is in terms of all the enablers put together. This is what we have achieved. In conclusion, what I would like to say that we continue to believe that trade facilitation is a very significant policy imperative. All of us would have read that there are studies to say that it costs about 14% of the world trade globally, and more so in developing countries. Our own belief on the basis of working in the field is that it's fairly significant in case of India. So large gains are to be achieved if India was to be able to reduce, was to improve trade facilitation in terms of measured reduction in the release time. And as Shruti said, so if I was to take 3 numbers in terms of the release time, in 2017, as JNCH, the average release time reported was 180 hours. I'm going by the time release study. We'd reduced it to 90 hours by 2020 January. I presume it would have improved further, but since the data is not available in public domain, we don't make a reference to it. And in any case, they would be available only after the paper was published. And then the national NTFAP target is about 48 hours, which essentially means that in 5 years, we have half the release time, and yet we need to further half the release time to actually achieve the target. That being so, the challenge of making changes in the policies that drive trade facilitation requires more detailed studies. And we intend to continue to do that. There is a larger aspect of theoretical study relating to tools of performance measurement, which needs to be studied, their deeper analysis. I think the two-way study, one, that the time period that we have covered in this study is limited by the fact that trade facilitation was introduced only in 2017. So a couple of years down the line, another study on this line to find how whether there is any need to change the conclusions that we had drawn in this paper would be welcome. The other option is to look at the data for publicly available data for some other select countries that we can use to find out whether these challenges are applicable to other countries as well, or they're not. And therefore, those of us in the CBIC continue to look forward to undertaking such theoretical and empirical research and support the facilitation activities of the Government of India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shruti, and thank you, Mr. Chauhan. This is very, very interesting. I just want to highlight one point which didn't come out so clearly in the presentation, because I found it very interesting, is that in the EODB measurement of trade across borders, there was a big change between 2018 and 19 in terms of the time taken for border compliance. It went from about 272 hours to 102 hours in just 1 year. And it is based on perception and surveys. And it seems, as you also imply in the paper, is that because the release time studies were actually made available, the perception survey itself responses changed, because people had imagined that it would be taking 272 hours, but actually when you saw the data, you suddenly saw a decline. And it's actually a very big issue in these measurement exercises. So if you look at the de jure versus de facto comparisons across other sectors, for example, construction permits, the enterprise survey that World Bank did in 2013-14 showed that it takes 33 days to get construction permits in India, while the EODB survey showed 180 days, because EODB focuses on de jure or perception-based estimates, while de facto is when the firm says this is what it took, and it took 33 days. And it's a big literature and growing literature across developing countries, especially, that the perception and de jure measures are very, very far from what you see at the de facto experience of firms. And it's important to build these kind of measurement systems which are actually capturing the real experience of firms in economies like India and China and so forth, which are basically growing very fast, and they're trying to change their systems as they go along, instead of just relying on de jure and perception studies. I think, and that this paper makes an important contribution in that direction. Now I would like to invite Professor Abhijit Das to share his comments on this paper.
Thanks a lot. At the outset, I must compliment the authors of the paper, both Vijay and Sruti, for having done an extremely commendable job. It appears to be a highly robust study, and they have studied an area which is often touted as being one of the bottlenecks preventing Indian firms from becoming attractive partners for lead firms in global value chains. So the implications of their findings in terms of betterment in policy, in terms of implementation of policy, is likely to have very far-reaching consequences. And if this exercise is continued at JNPT and a few other ports, I have no doubt in my mind that this research initiative will be taken as the starting point, which helps the country to address some of the pressing challenges regarding trade facilitation. And if, as a consequence of this effort, the release time gets reduced further, then certainly the implications are going to be extremely favorable and far-reaching for the entire international trading community. Having said that, maybe I have one very small observation. The dissonance in different indicators, could that be on account of capturing different aspects of enablers of trade facilitation? Maybe the study has looked at that and it got missed out in the presentation, but maybe a very short analysis of that aspect would be highly relevant for completeness of this exercise. Overall, I have no further comments except to compliment once again wholeheartedly the authors for doing a very pioneering work in an area which has huge policy implications and doing it very robustly. So compliments once again to both Vijay and Shruti. I'm going to stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Das. Mr. Johri, could you please share your remarks on the paper now?
Thank you very much and good evening, everyone. Let me also begin by complimenting the team, the duo, who've conducted this study and made the presentation today. I think it's very commendable work, and it's also very topical, particularly in the context of developments that have taken place in recent years, with regard to international trade at the WTO. And what has triggered it off is, the conclusion of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. So as you're aware, the agreement has a large number of trade facilitation measures that are applicable to border management agencies. But one of the questions that has been plaguing, these agencies, even as they implement the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, is how to measure the effectiveness of, these initiatives, and whether, there is any way in which we can measure the performance of border management agencies, whose role is so critical, in the realm of trade facilitation. So that is a question which has begun to be debated, I think, amongst not only customs administrations, but those parts of government that deal with international trade. And the standard methodology which the WCO, the World Customs Organization, recommends, and which has also been adopted in the Trade Facilitation Agreement, is the time release study. I think what this paper has tried to do is very significant because it has tried to juxtapose some of the sort of measures or indicators which could be taken, to mean surrogate measures of the performance of border management agencies. So, of course, when you talk about the non-composite indices which have been referred to in the paper, for example, the time release study, and other measures which actually rely on customs data to look at timestamps and measure how much time it's taken on an average for a consignment to be cleared. The purpose of those measures is to connect, whatever trade facilitation initiatives we've taken with the outcome. And there are two types of measures that are envisaged in the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Some, are directly connected to release time and release cost. For example, if you were to resort to, let's say, advanced filing and advanced processing of documents, one of the measures included in the WTO TFA. It has a direct bearing on the release time and release cost. And I think the time release study brings it out very clearly. Facilitated consignments, for example, very clearly have a much quicker release time vis-a-vis those where there is an interdiction by any of the border management agencies. So that connect between the measure and the outcome, in some cases, is very easy to sort of figure out. In other cases, which have been talked about in the paper as enablers, it is a more sort of amorphous linkage. For example, do we know and can we, for example, measure, the significance of transparency, availability of information, advanced ruling, prior consultations with the trade, before a change is made in policy? Can these be directly related to release time? I mean, that is a question which is the answer to which is not so clear cut, and how we can measure that the implication or the impact of these initiatives on the release time is an even more difficult area to study. The other thing which results in some sort of dissonance between a direct measure of release time and the composite measures, of course, is that the composite measures take into account several other factors which may or may not have a direct linkage with the working of border management agencies. That's one. And secondly, some of them are just using a signpost language to tick the box. For example, if you talk about advanced ruling, some of the composite measures like the logistics performance index or the TF index would just check whether a particular customs administration has in place an advanced ruling arrangement or not. And that is enough for you to score on that particular parameter. It is not going into the question of whether that measure is actually being used by the trade. If so, to what extent? So what is the utilization rate of a particular measure? And whether an advanced ruling is actually resulting in a reduction in release time. I mean, there's no sort of quantitative or objective study to sort of measure that. So that could be one of the reasons I find that there is dissonance between some of the composite measures and the time release study measure, which is obviously more objective and more concrete, because it's looking at the overall impact of all these enablers and using release time as a representative sort of parameter, which factors in all the sort of initiatives that have been put in place. The other thing which comes out quite clearly from the study which has been done is that most of the measures are focusing on release time, except the EODB, and trading across borders particularly, which also looks at release cost. Most of the measures are looking at release time. The underlying assumption being that, if you're impacting the release time, you're automatically impacting the release cost. Now, that is true. That is not something which can be disputed because, time can, the longer the time it takes for cargo to dwell in a port for whatever reason, the higher the cost. I mean, there's a direct proportional relationship between the two. But what we're missing out on when measuring performance in this way is that there are factors which impact cost, but they do not necessarily operate through release time. And those factors are perhaps not accounted for when we do studies or when we look at indices that measure only the release time or that are focused only on the release time. And some of these costs are fairly significant. For example, charges that are paid to custodians for lifting a box from a vessel and placing it on the wharf, charges that are paid to custodians for as a fixed cost, not as a rental, which is dependent on the time for which the box stays in their custody. So there is that element of cost which we miss out on when we look only at release time. So these are some of the things, of course, which some of the factors that are relevant and which bring out the salience of the study, which these two have done. The last thing I want to talk about, of course, is also the difference in methodology. And this is pretty obvious when you look at the methodology which has been used for most of the composite indicators, barring some. This is based on perception surveys. In fact, surprisingly, for the trading across borders also, it is based on a perception survey. And of course, then there are questions about sampling and whether the sample of respondents that is spoken to is representative or not. What is the degree of outreach that has been done with those stakeholders? Are they aware of some of these changes? Have they actually sort of measured the impact of these changes, when they're conducting their business? So those are all questions that are out there for anyone to sort of see. But obviously, to that extent, there is a bias or there is a lacuna in perception surveys. Although as Indians, perhaps we should not be making that point, because we find, surprisingly, that the trading across borders measurement of release time has been, consistently better than the measurement that we've done through the time release study. So, I mean, there could be biases either which way in the data that perception surveys throw up. So these are some of the points I wanted to make, and I'll stop there and we'll take the discussion further as it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johri. So I'll give both the authors an opportunity to respond to some of these comments once we are done listening to the discussants. So now I would like to invite Dr. Harsha Vardhan Singh to share his comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rai. Thank you, and thanks to Carnegie India for this opportunity. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with the experts, both of whom I know for quite some time. So my hello to them at this stage, and also my appreciation to the authors. This is a study I truly enjoyed reading. It is a major advance on the work which we have in this area. Some of the points regarding the overall perception, evaluation, etc., have been made by Mr. Vivek Johri. It saves me time because I had the same thoughts also. But I'll take one step back, even from the level at which the discussion has been till now. And in that context, I want to add some comments also, Mr. Rai, to what you have said, because I think you made two very important points. I'll start with your points. One was that no country should rely on international measures, saying that we should make our own. I half agree with you on that. I'll tell you why I'm doing this. Because the purpose of the measure is to compare ourselves with other countries which are competing with us. And that is something which the international measure does. But if we need to be very targeted and identify where we need to improve ourselves, we need our own measures, or supplement the international measures with our own efforts. You made a very important point about perception and versus reality, which can work both ways, as Mr. Johri just pointed out. But that is a very important point, because normally the feedback one gets from industry and exporters is that the policy is not being implemented properly. So something which is hurting them at any point of time, the impact of that gets magnified. And therefore, more often than not, perhaps the perception is that the performance is worse than what it actually might be. And if that perception could be corrected, it'll go a long way. Now, I want to actually posit this very important work. And it's truly path-breaking in several senses. In terms of evaluation, I think after an initial paper which Vivek Johri had done with another of his colleagues, I think this extends the frontier. So kudos for that. The background which I want to posit is, why do we look at all this? Why was trade facilitation emphasized in the context of WTO negotiations, and more so it started earlier in the context of regional or plurilateral or bilateral free trade agreements? It was because everybody started emphasizing, after recognition of the impact of FDI, that trade had become very fragmented. So there is a cycle of imports coming in, being processed, being sent out. In fact, if you really think of value chains, global value chains, each product is counted to be part of a global value chain when it crosses at least 2 borders. So if it has to cross borders and come back again to another border, it requires an environment to operate which is facilitated. That's why trade facilitation was emphasized. In that context, on 6th August this year, the Prime Minister made a very important speech where he laid out his vision for a manifold increase in exports, in links to global value chains, to production in manufacturing, etc. It's in that background that I just want to take this study, which it is a very important contribution to a part of that journey. So first of all, overall trade facilitation, which is required for the global value chain, is far larger than the trade facilitation as it is covered under the WTO agreement. So you have a big circle. Within that, you have another circle, which is smaller. And within that, you have a still smaller circle, which is the study, which is the focus of this study, time release study. So in some sense, if you are looking, and this is what Mr. Johri was also pointing out, that the universe of facilitation or what really impacts upon the operations is larger than the study, but this study is a part of it and a very important effort which you have done right now. And I think, as Professor Das said, when more work will be done, this will be seen as a major turning point in the academic or intellectual work trying to specify it. So when you take this larger area of facilitation, it's in that context that I just want to say that we need to see, because some indices, and again, Mr. Johri rightly pointed out, there are several reasons for the dissonance. But I wonder, and maybe this could be the next thought for the authors, each of these indices which you have compared have some part of the larger trade facilitation I'm talking about. Not just the WTO agreement per se, but a larger trade facilitation part. Can you pick that up and then combine it into a composite index with its elements so that the policymaker can see where am I going, where am I weaker than somebody else? I'll give you an example. I just, for the sake of comparison, took the 2019 OECD Trade Facilitation Index, and I took the values for India, China, Mexico, Thailand, and Vietnam. So these are countries which compete with each other. More so Vietnam and China with India than Mexico and Thailand, but still, they are there in the game. So of the 11 indices, in 4 of them, India has the last rank amongst the 5. For 2 of them, India has the second last rank. So not only do we need to look at the index per se? We need to look at individual components, which you've done in the study, and find out where are we worse off, even if the measurement is way off. If the difference is large, the qualitative message from those numbers is very clear. So where are we the worst? In advanced rulings, and you have to work very hard on that, Mr. Chauhan, and it'll really help. The interesting thing is, advanced rulings, China and Vietnam have a perfect score, sort of, almost. And we are way off. So then documentation. So what is the burden of documents? Then procedures. What is the burden of procedures? I mean, this is not rocket science. These are areas we know we need to work on to reduce the regulatory burden. What this does is gives you a measure, a handle. Therefore, in my perspective, and that's why, Mr. Rai, these international indices are important. The other aspect is that there are some instances where these competing economies actually perform worse than us. Like take trading across borders. India's number is 68. This is the rank. Vietnam is 104. But still, when you talk to investors, and we are trying to woo investors, and India has done very well in getting FDI in terms of the total. The latest report of UNCTAD showed that we were now the fifth largest, up from 9th earlier. So, but Vietnam is perceived by investors as much better. Why is that? One of the things is that Vietnam actually has a policy of having a preferential track for large firms. Professor Das talked about lead firms. These lead firms in many segments are actually international firms. They do not have the same policy or treatment given to the operations of these large firms because they know that they will be the locomotive of change for them. And what a locomotive they have been. I'll give you an example. In 2001, electronics exports of Vietnam were 80% of those which were from India. So if India exported 100, Vietnam exported 80. In 2020, Vietnam's exports of electronics were 11 times the exports of India. If India exported 100, Vietnam exported 1100. That is the kind of transformation they have managed because of the way they pay attention to precisely the elements we are discussing here. But they have a preferential treatment of the firms which will make a large difference. Therefore, it is perceived better. That is something which we don't do, which is not a bad thing. But at the same time, we have begun to distinguish between large firms and the others, because if you have to create champions, you need to have global champions present here. The other thing is, in this paper, I saw a comparison. And again, I must say, it's an excellent paper. You compared with South Asian nations. They are not our competitors, other than Bangladesh in apparel or in clothing. So for a policy perspective, we need to identify whom we need to improve in comparison to. And let's not choose the most difficult example of China. But if we move towards the second best or the third best, if we are the fifth best and we become third best, that is change in the right direction. So that is the kind of usage, or that is the kind of frame of reference. So this time release study is very good for measuring our own performance. But if the other country is doing even better, in terms of our export performance, we may not be very, very different. So we have to do something which the other country becomes relatively lesser competitive than us. In fact, that is the treatment which you do when you look at the disability analysis. In fact, the PLI index, the basis of that was that. How am I in comparison to the other country with respect to the policies they use and the policies we use? Where do we need to really focus on? Where is the largest impact? Which are my low-hanging fruits? So again, like the large circle within that and the smaller one, your study is a very important part of this whole. But this whole has to then connect with the larger part, something which Mr. Johri was talking about. I think I've already taken a lot of time. I have many more thoughts, but we can do it offline. Thank you, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Thank you. Shruti, Mr. Chauhan, would you like to respond to these comments? Maybe a few minutes, and then we have one question as of now. If other participants want to ask any question, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A box that you see below your screen. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can do it through the chat function, please. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Das, Mr. Johri, and Mr. Singh. Thank you very much for the compliments and for the insightful comments, and Suyash as well. Our own thoughts is that none of the comments, all the comments are relevant, and we are aware of it. When we started, we actually didn't know how much to cover in the first paper, and as I said, that it was like almost the first tentative steps that we were taking, and the challenges of so the first point that Mr. Das made about the methodologies would be different. What they started out to measure are different. So the way we were initially, when I thought of this paper, I thought that all of them would be broadly moving in the same direction. We were not looking for. So what surprised? So we were, and that's why we took it from the NTFAP, and we thought that the direction would actually be the same. What surprised us was the fact that the directions were also sometimes fairly contradictory. And therefore, in one part of the paper that we didn't discuss today was that we took out the sub-components which we thought should be more closely aligned. And yet they were not. The other objective of the paper was to actually kind of recognize the importance of performance measurement and the limits that they should be taken on. It would be unfair, and it would be actually self-defeating if we were to get obsessed with performance indicators and say that all our efforts must be directed towards improving the ranking, and particularly if those rankings are based on surveys. As Mr. Johri said, the most interesting part of this exercise, and most satisfying perhaps, is that when we started off with the time release study in Namasheva in 2017, and Mr. Johri was there as the chief commissioner, the perception was about 50% of the average release time was 50% more than what was actually being achieved. And by the end of 2020, the perception was actually better than the average release time reported by this. So it actually says that the perception, which also means that it's easier to change perception. Perhaps it's easier to change perception than to change reality, even though we recognize that the two are linked. Those are areas for fascinating more study, and they require a lot more data and a lot more time and effort. And we to the extent that we will have time to pursue this, we will continue to do that, and come up with research papers which also support and answer some of the interesting academic or intellectual questions that are there. The topic of larger performance measurement and what drives them and the theoretical construct of it, and when seen from the point of view of performance measurement, is actually something which I have been pursuing since this paper was published. So everything going right, I should have something more on the theoretical construct of performance measurement viewed from the point of view of trade facilitation. Shruti agreeing, perhaps we'll write a common paper all over on that as well. Thank you so much for the kind words, the insightful comments. I must thank both Mr. Das and Mr. Vivek Johri. Mr. Vivek Johri also for actually being the guide for us to take this study. So he was guiding it when we were there in terms of the exercise, and he's also helped us with a lot of insights and putting it all together, because at one stage we were actually struggling to put together the results that we were finding of the statistical study, which quite often is a challenge. And that's where when the guidance of some of the people who've done this for a longer period than us comes in handy. So thank you very much, and it has been pleasure. Thank you, Suyash, and thank you, Carnegie, for.
There is a question, sir. I would like to. Yes. There is still we have 5 minutes. If you could yes. Answer the question, Mr. S. Ramesh, former chairman CFCBIC, he has congratulated you on this presentation on the paper, but he also has a question. He's asking, given the new customs faceless assessment paradigm with possible gaps in faceless assessment groups and the port assessment group /JPC, would the present TRS methodology be modified suitably to capture the time taken realistically?
I am no longer involved with the exercise of conduct of time release study, but I understand that the national time release study, which is one of the recommendations of the NTFAP, is under implementation, and that adopts the same methodology which has been adopted by the JNCH TRS. Once the results of that come out, and depending on that, I think it would be up to CBIC to decide whether there is any change required, because the point that Mr. Ramesh makes is that thereafter you cannot hold the JNCH team responsible for the time taken in the assessment, etc. of the country. But if the TRS is a national TRS which covers all the ports in the country, then perhaps that that concern is slightly mitigated.
Mr. Johri, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say that, the underlying assumption of moving to faceless is that it should make no difference on the ground. So I agree with Vijay that the basic methodology for measuring release time would continue to be the same. Because, the underlying assumption of faceless is that geography doesn't matter. And therefore, it should not change the methodology. I just want to quickly respond to 1-2 points which Dr. Harsha Vardhan Singh made, and I value his comments a lot. So one of the things is that he talked about giving a fast track to lead firms. I just wanted to mention that we already have an authorized economic operators program in which we register traders who we consider safe and who've undergone some sort of a basic check with regard to their compliance behavior or not. And they are given a fast track treatment. So I just wanted to mention that as a point of fact. The other thing, Dr. Singh, is that I do agree with you. We need a standardized or harmonized measure across customs administration so that, we are able to compare. But we also need to compete with ourselves. And to that extent, a national, measure is important because, we have our own reality and we have our own factors that impinge on release time, cost, etc. And therefore, perhaps we need both. So I just want to make those 2 quick points. Thank you.
Dr. Singh, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these 2 comments. In fact, I would go further than what you did. Not perhaps, we absolutely need both. And that's the point I was making. we cannot do without either. So we need both, but for different purposes. On the authorized operators program, there's a reason why I picked up on lead firms. Because lead firms are those which basically manage global value chains. The initiative on authorized operators program which you have is a very good one. It still has its own glitches, but that's something, again, like what you did with time release study, you can do a study on that and try and address it. Because as we can see from the comments the two authors and you have made, there is an effort to keep on improving. Just one point, sorry, just going back. So while both Bangladesh and Vietnam, which have beaten India in terms of market shares in certain products, they have some facilitated programs for certain kind of operators. For those who are lead firms, major firms which link up with exports, they have a still more preferential program. So that's the point I was making, that they pay exclusive attention to them. For example, in a subsidy scheme, which is income tax exemption, the normal kind of program for preferential treatment was a low percentage of 5% for 9 years. To a lead firm, they gave 26 years in Vietnam. So, you know, that's the kind of engagement they have with lead firms, because they tailor-make these programs. And it's not only Vietnam. Singapore does it, Mexico does it. So all these different countries, they do it. It was interesting that the perception was worse than the reality initially. And the reality changed the perception. So, Mr. Chauhan, yeah, that's a good point, but it always will happen. And that's where this faceless interaction of the system with the trading community also has to be adjusted in terms of an initial kind of result, and then when you settle down, what the result will be. So initially, it'll be a surprise whether it is the relationship of reality being better than perception or worse than perception. Both ways, it'll be a surprise, because we really don't know the reality. The fact that you make effort to find that out is commendable. It needs to be done, and it will change. Like you yourself said in one instance, that the reality was far worse than the perception. Likewise, for faceless assessment, the feedback I have received is that initially, because the person who's chosen is randomly selected, they have no prior perception of the issues that arise vis-a-vis specific industries which they are looking at. And in that context, the initial part is going to actually delay. The fact that it delays does not mean the methodology should change. What that methodology should see is where is the delay coming from, due to, and how to address it. Some of the industries which I talked to, they actually, for the faceless assessor, they organized a WhatsApp group so that all questions could be comprehensively addressed. And once that 6 months is over, I think we'll settle down to a new, better performance. And also, you know, arm's length performance, which is part of good governance. So initially, the result may be different from what you would like it to be or expect it to be, but the actual result over time, once the system stabilizes, is likely to be the one you have to judge on. And in that context, evolve your methodology accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Your passion for these issues is quite infectious. It's good to always hear from you. We are out of time. I would like to thank the authors and the discussants for joining us today. I'll just make one plug on my behalf of my institution that we love to nudge practitioners, especially in government, to write papers, to write articles, to share their insights, because a lot of insights and intuitions are embedded in their minds, and a lot of them write after retirement, and that's great. But that's great for memoirs. For usable research right now, it's important to write about issues like these, which are burning and which need to be solved on an ongoing basis. And you may be surprised, there will be officers somewhere else in the country who will read and get inspired by it. So if you want to write a paper on any issue that you're working on, please reach out to us. We'll be very happy to help you. I mean, we will provide you assistance as research. We will help you editorial support. We can see through the production process. It's important for more and more practitioners to write papers and articles and share their insights. Thank you, and have a good evening, all of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And very nice to see you, Vivek.
Thanks so much.
And
Thanks,
Abhijit.
Dr. Singh. Thanks, Abhijit.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
I'll get in touch.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
And the two authors.
Yes,
Thank
you.
of course.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor
Suyash.
Das. Good to see you.